Serious, Reddit, what's your scariest, most disturbing true story? Not nearly as serious, but a little creepy. My neighbor is an old lady. She comes outside everyone once in a while to chat with passers-by and garden. In the first conversation she had with my dad, she complimented the painting he has hanging in his bedroom. No big deal, she probably saw us moving it in, or glimpsed it at some point before we got curtains. But then she meets our dog and says, well, he's much scarier through the window. Isn't he? Again, NBD, we know he has a habit of pushing aside blinds to stare outside. She comments on things like this often, asking us why we didn't walk our dog that morning or when we got a new sofa, but she's just an old lady, right? She's probably bored and outside a lot. Then she meets me. She swears she's already met me, but I had never seen her before in my life. She asks me how I like my room and tells me about the girls who had it before me. It's weird, but okay. She rubbed me the wrong way, but I don't really mind, she's fairly easy to avoid. Or so I thought. As I was taking the dog outside, I happened to glance over and see her staring at me through the window. She lowers the blinds when she sees that I saw her but is peeking through them watching me. Later, I go to the kitchen and see her again watching me very intently through the window. Our blinds were slightly open to let light in. Then upstairs in my parents' room, there's a window in their bathroom. I see her again as I'm replacing the towels, watching. The more I looked for her, the more I saw her. She was watching basically all the time. Not only from her window, but she also sits in her car and watches us from the street. She sits on her porch and watches. She slowly walks down the street and watches us, literally all hours of the day. And she does it to her other neighbors, and she did it to the people who had our house before us. Everyone knew to keep their blinds and curtains shut at all times, otherwise, you can guarantee she watches you. It freaked me the hell out. Recently a friend and I were swapping our favorite horror movies. We were childhood friends that grew up in the same Detroit suburb. I was thinking about an incident that had happened when I was in 2nd or 3rd grade, 30 years ago, and she says out of the blue, I don't know if you remember this, but the police started patrolling our neighborhood when we were in 2nd or 3rd grade because when I was walking home from school 2 men in a blue pickup truck rolled down the window next to me and said, "Hey girl, you need a ride home," and one tried to grab me. I took off running, tearing through yards, and I told my mom, who called the cops and walked with me to the bus stop after that. I confessed that I was thinking about a time when my cousin Sean recently passed away, so he's been on my mind. Also, he was really smart, much smarter than I, and I were wandering around the neighborhood as kids did in the 80s. This blue pickup truck pulled up to us and one of the 2 guys asked us to hop in for a ride. Sean said, "No thanks," and instructed me to sneak into a neighbor's back porch, luckily unlocked, and stay down. I whispered I was afraid we would get in trouble for not asking the neighbor for permission. Not the brightest kid, I would rather die than break the rules, I guess, and Sean goes, "Stay here and hide. Act as if we went inside because we live here." One of the 2 guys got out of the truck and went into the yard to look for us. We laid low. About 15 minutes later he left. I look back on it now and think, what a close call. We live near the area of the Oakland County child killer, though in a much poorer neighborhood than he targeted, and I've spent the last few nights reading about the case and thinking about that blue truck.
My ex-husband kidnapped my kids. A church was helping him hide them from me. I was a Catholic, therefore an idol worshiper, and he was Baptist. He wasn't religious when we got married, but was in his past. I guess when he hits a life crisis his answer is the nearest mega church. He was in the army and told them I was killed in a car wreck and had to go get the kids. Then he went into hiding. I got a colonel up at 3 a.m. and he was back with the kids in 72 hours. Scariest weekend of my life.
A few years ago, I went to the kitchen around 2 a.m. to get a glass of water. I figured, why put the lights on if I'm gonna be done in 5 seconds, right? So, 10-year-old me was in complete darkness when I noticed someone staring through our window, with their hands pressed against the glass we had seen through curtains. I screamed at the top of my lungs and froze. Mom woke up and came running to the kitchen to me crying like a baby in my pajamas. He was already gone, but I told her what happened, so she went outside with a knife to look for him but never found him. And that's why we don't have seen through curtains anymore. I still have an irrational fear of the dark.
I was on a backpacking trip on the Appalachian Trail, and my dad and I stopped at one of the many public cabins. We set our bags down and joined the campfire. It was just us and a middle-aged Asian couple. We begin talking and the sun sets, so we don't expect anyone else to come. Nevertheless, this huge guy with long silver hair sets his small pack down under the awning and joins us at the fire. He was no less than 6 feet 8 inches, extremely muscular, and had his hair tied back into a ponytail. Imagine a more muscular Geralt from The Witcher. We start talking and he seems very friendly. Then, my dad asks the man, "So, where are you from?" No response. My dad repeats the question, thinking the guy didn't hear him. No response. The Asian guy asks the question, and suddenly, the big guy explodes yelling, "I don't know." He, then, takes out a huge Bowie knife and a whetstone and starts sharpening it. All of us decide to pack our stuff and book it into the next cabin, which was about 7 miles away. It was a walk, but we eventually made it there, and there was a dirty hippie man already there. He stunk like hell but was harmless. We stop at the campfire and hang out for a bit, then I see a reflection out of the corner of my eye. I turn around and see the big, silver-haired guy standing in the tree line, spying on us. At that moment, I nearly dipped my pants, because there was no way all of us could take this guy on. He was built like a WWE wrestler, and we were all under 6 feet. I let the other people know, and the Asian guy took out a revolver, and told the man to go. The big guy stands there for a moment and silently walks off into the woods without making any sound. After that incident, we agreed to have someone keep watch. Since the Asian guy had a gun, he volunteered while we slept. In the morning, I was so glad the big guy didn't come back because the Asian man fell asleep. That still gives me chills.
A guy followed me home from the train station once. I think he still knows where I live. I got out of work and was waiting at the train station. I had my headphones in and was staring at the TV with the arrival/departure times. This guy suddenly appeared out of nowhere, got really close to my face, and asked me if I had a boyfriend. I said nothing and walked away quickly. He looked/smelled homeless and had these big, crazy eyes that were darting around the room as he spoke. He also had an erection and had gotten so close that he'd spit on my cheek. There are weird people at train stations. Whatever. I'll never see him again anyway. Move on. After I get off the train, I take 2 buses and walk a few blocks to get home. I was focused on the podcast that I was listening to and wasn't paying attention to my surroundings. All of the buses were also very crowded. When I reached my stop and started to walk home, I noticed that the creepy guy got off the bus behind me. There was nobody else around, so ran home. When I got to my door and started to unlock it, he was standing at the end of my driveway. I was crying and fumbling with my keys. Then some of my neighbors pulled up in a truck, and I screamed, "Hello, sir, help." Then the creepy guy turned and walked away into the woods. I called the police, but they didn't show up for a while. They had me write a statement but seemed uninterested. My husband left work early and came home. We saw the creepy guy lingering around the neighborhood and walking past our house a few times in the following days, but he eventually stopped. Haven't seen him since.
In high school, I and a friend made the dumbass decision to smoke weed in a graveyard around 8 to 9 at night, summertime, so it was just now getting dark. I smoked to the point of being out of it. We were just chilling next to a tree when I see a man walking down the graveyard. I got a little nervous immediately but blew it off. I then see the man pull out a handgun and aim towards something. He didn't notice us at this point and I couldn't see who or what he was aiming it at. I was so terrified I thought I was mildly hallucinating, I couldn't even move. My friend hit my side and said, "Dude, this guy has a gun out, we got to get out of here." We both slowly got up, but like the stoned idiots we were, we hit a rock trying to get up and the man finally noticed us. He was a good 200 feet away from us, but the second he saw it he slowly moved toward us with the gun in his hand. We started running at this point. I looked behind my shoulder once and saw him start to run toward us as well. We booked it out of the graveyard and were finally back in my neighborhood. I was terrified for days after that.
When I was 12, I saw two tourists struggling to communicate with the cashier at a bookstore in Indonesia. I'm bilingual, so I just hopped over and helped translate before going back to browsing my books. After paying, one of the guys came over to thank me. He wanted to take me out for dinner to repay me. Being 12, of course, I told him I can't have dinner without my parents' permission. He went, "I'm sure you can sneak out, right?" No. By now, I noticed his friend come up behind me, so I'm kind of boxed between them in the middle of two bookshelves. My sister had already ducked under one and ran off, leaving me alone. They were really persistent and asked me if I could grab lunch or drinks instead. I'm 12. Finally, one of the salesgirls noticed something was off and came to ask if anything was wrong. I get out of there. My sister and I went to another store, and suddenly, my sister started freaking out since they were right behind us. Okay, maybe it's a coincidence. We went to a lingerie store. They followed. Okay, we're definitely being followed. We ran to the store our mom was in and the salespeople there called security. I thought they were slightly creepy at that time, but now that I'm older, they were creepy. Oh, and I'm Asian, so at 12, I looked 8 to 9.
My girlfriend and I went to Walmart one night at about 11:30. We parked close with only one spot open to us on our left. As we were slowly making our way down the grocery aisles, I happened to notice a guy out of the corner of my eye with no buggy or cart. When I looked over, he grabbed a box of something and stared intently at it, not the kind of absent-minded, "I am shopping" kind of look. I make a side note of it, and we continue down a few more aisles. After seeing the man in our aisles and vicinity a few more times, I tell my girlfriend, "Let's go aimlessly wander around other parts of the store for a bit so I can gauge if my suspicions are correct." About 30 minutes later we end up at the self-checkout. Guess who is sitting on the bench in front of the self-checkout with no bags? I think to myself, maybe coincidence, maybe not. As we leave the Walmart, all of a sudden I get this feeling and tell my girlfriend to stop, and I stop abruptly as well. When I turn around, this guy had almost run into us. He was following so closely and we had stopped so abruptly. He stared at me like a deer in headlights, and so did I, because I couldn't really mentally process the implications of what he, presumably, intended to do. After a brief deer in headlights, he keeps walking as if nothing happens, then gets into a windowless white van that is now occupying the empty left parking spot next to my car. This was a few years ago, and I still think about it a lot and what could have happened. There were too many coincidences for that to merely be my anxiety interpreting the situation as something it wasn't. This is actually kind of embarrassing, but anyways, last year I was watching my parents' house while they were out of the state. They live on a wooded plot of land and have been known to have trespassers on their property. I got home one night at about 11 p.m., and I'm standing in the foyer. The way the foyer is, I can see into the kitchen, which has windows. The only light in the house is the moonlight coming in the windows. Against the light, I can see the silhouette of someone standing there. My heart immediately started slamming against my chest and I ask, "Who's there?" No answer. I ask again, and as I'm asking, I'm moving the keys that I was holding into the spaces between my fingers, so I had a weapon. Again, there was no answer. I start moving and the figure starts moving too, exactly the same way I was. I put 2 and 2 together and I flick on the lights, and I see a reflection of myself in the mirror that's in the foyer. I witnessed an argument between my mom and stepdad about some green Heinz ketchup my mom had bought. His response was to drag my mother by her hair to the bedroom where he loaded a shotgun, then pressed his head against hers and tried to force her to pull the trigger. All the while I'm standing in the doorway watching in complete silence. She ended up saving herself by putting her finger behind the trigger and was left with a blood blister from him trying to pull it regardless. She eventually wriggled free, and he says, "I'm just going to kill myself then." To which my mom responds with, "Well, do it outside, because I really don't feel like cleaning up the mess." That took balls. He could have just shot her right there. What's crazy is at the time it all seemed so normal to me.
I ran on the track team in high school, and during my first 2 years, I rode the late after-school bus to get home. On Tuesday through Thursday there were 2 buses that took students home, but on Mondays and Fridays everyone had to ride one bus, and the bus was driven by this really creepy guy. He would look at girls through the rearview mirror and stare at them for lengthy periods of time while giving this really unsettling smile which made all of the girls uncomfortable. One day this guy was the bus driver who took our team to a track meet at another school. The buses would normally stay parked in the parking lot for the duration of the meeting. Well, I had a while until my next race, so I decided to go and watch my teammates run, and I went to watch by the gate which was near the track's entrance. It started to drizzle, so I go to stand under this pavilion to keep dry. After a few minutes I see the bus driver there, and he comes over to me and asks me if I want to get on the bus to keep out of the rain. At this point, I'm really nervous. But I say yes anyway, because I'm afraid of what will happen if I say no. So, the 2 of us start heading to the bus, and I'm freaking out when a few of my male teammates see that I'm about to get on the bus, and they decide that they want to get out of the rain too. They come over to the bus as I'm about to get on and ask if they can get on, but the bus driver shakes his head and says, "Not you guys. Just her." Now I'm really scared and I stutter out that I'm sorry, but I don't want to go on the bus anymore, and I take off to the bleachers where I stayed for the rest of the meet. Even though nothing happened, I still get sort of queasy thinking about what could have happened if those guys hadn't come and I had gone on the bus.
It's really not that bad. And maybe there are some other explanations, and maybe it's not actually my most disturbing true story, but I've been thinking about it the last few days. So near where I live is this little place called Concrete City. It's just this circle of empty concrete buildings that used to be homes to coal miners or something like. But it is totally abandoned now, and some of the structures are crumbling. It's like a giant, concrete playground for young adults to smoke up, tag the walls, and play paintball. So, I and a couple of others are wandering around the place, and we start coming up on this parked car. I could 2 people in the front shuffling around, and I was just thinking, oh great, we're about to walk up on 2 people screwing. Nobody else in the group seemed to pay it any mind, so I keep walking. Then I notice it was not a couple. 2 big dudes are in the front, staring us up and down, sitting stock still, and looking shady. Still, we all just keep going, and at this point, I'm just glad we're in a group of 5 and still kind of scared. As in, chopped to bits and spread around in piles, and then I see why I get this exact feeling. We're all right up alongside the car now, and I can't help but glance in the back window. An open cooler filled with bloody ice, a second closed cooler, probably filled with the same, and a pile of transparent plastic bags. I keep my mouth shut and keep walking. When we're just past the car, the engine revs up and those 2 dudes tear out of there like hell's behind them, so it could be a couple of poachers, or maybe organ theft, and somewhere in a concrete city lay a man with a missing kidney. I don't know, but it was shady. When I was a kid, me and my friend were walking into a nearby park just after lunch. As we entered, an older guy who was probably in his mid to late teens approached us. He asked if we wanted to see the guns he had in his trunk, and we of course said no and tried walking away, but he grabbed my friend and tried dragging him toward his car. We screamed for help, and he let go and ran off towards his car. A little while later, a couple of police officers stopped us and asked if we had seen a teenager matching his description, so we told them what happened. Luckily I had a great memory as a kid and remembered his license plate, so after telling the cops everything they escorted us back to my place. A week later we found out this guy had abducted and raped 6 kids and ended up being tried as an adult instead of a teenager and is probably still in prison. I still remember the incident pretty clearly.
Found a body when I was 14. I and my family were hiking Easter morning along the Grand River, and I and my sister wanted to explore the riverbank, so we each went our separate ways. I saw a backpack hanging from a small tree, so I went over, but when I got closer I saw a mannequin. The mannequin's hand was holding onto a branch and it was lying face down in the mud wearing jeans and a hoodie with the hood up. There was a gun on the ground, I thought it was fake, and an empty pack of Scooby-Doo fruit gummies. I decided to kick the thing, but when my foot connected with its thigh I instantly knew it was a person. Bolted out of there and I told my dad. I thought I kicked some sleeping homeless dude and I was super paranoid, sprinting back toward my parents. My father went to investigate and said it was a body, so we called 911. Later found out the guy had killed himself, bullet to the roof of the mouth, but he slightly misfired and probably lived for around 30 seconds after the shot. The police were incredibly surprised we didn't hear a gunshot because it was that recent. The reason I thought it was a mannequin was that his hand was elevated. This caused all of the blood to drain out and pool in his body, which made his hand look snow white like a mannequin's hand would. Never saw any blood and never got to find out what was in the bag. Thank God I didn't see his face. I was 12 years old, and we were 3 kids sharing 2 bedrooms. So, my dad decided to put up a half wall to make a third. If I stood on my bed I could see into my brother's room. We were young and used to throw a ball over before falling asleep. One night I was just drifting off when my mom taps me on the shoulder and says, "What are you doing?" I thought that was a very weird question. Obviously, I'm sleeping. So, I turn around to answer her, only it was not my mom. It's not a person. It looked like a 3D shadow of a man. Just black. I screamed while my eyes were closed, and the figure disappeared. My mom and dad came running into my room. I tell them everything. They think it was just my imagination, but tell me if I'm scared to go sleep in the room with my brother. I tried to sleep, but I was shaking. My brother woke up once to go use the bathroom upstairs, and I pretended I was asleep. I didn't want him to know I was still afraid. It was just that one night. I never saw anything like it again, or even close. But years later, in my 20s, I was living alone and felt the tap on my shoulder. "What are you doing?" I'll stop there because you'll think I'm crazy. But that was the last time I heard it. And I'm 31 now. It's not a ghost story. I will remember that day until I die. This is my worst nightmare. I have had sleep paralysis and terrors and nightmares since my earliest memories. If someone were ever actually there and it wasn't sleeping paralysis, I don't know that I'd ever survive the ensuing anxiety. My most recent was a few months ago when my husband was in an Asian country. I live in the US, and my 5 and 4-year-old were at school and I was home with the sick baby. She was napping, 3 months old, and I was so tired so I decided to nap too. I woke up in the room I fell asleep in, always happens this way for me too, and saw the shadow of a man in the doorway. Because I also lucid dream often, I thought, oh, in my half-sleep/half awake state, not really there. Then he closed my bedroom door and stared at me. Because I lucid dream and have sleep paralysis, I thought I lifted my head, and he started walking towards me. Then bam! I'm waking up in bed. And that one was creepy. Baby is still asleep, so I get up to go pee. And hear him walking along the hallway towards her room. Ensue panic overload. There is maybe someone really here. You aren't gonna touch that baby unless it's over my dead body. Lunge towards the door. Wake up again like, on God, what is happening? Is someone really here? Is this all in my head? Please, for the sake of sanity, give me a sign of whether I should kill someone or wake up. I can frequently wake myself up when I realize I'm having a sleep terror or lucid dreaming based on markers that tell me this isn't real, and he opens my door and comes at me slowly with a bat. At this point, I finally woke myself up. I attribute the late realization of markers due to my ongoing lack of sleep with the baby. I still have trouble being in the house without my husband, but haven't told him because he'd feel guilty for traveling for work so much.
As I was writing my other post, I was reminded of the time my friend and I traveled to Europe together when we were about 16 to 17. We both loved animals and would buy sausages to feed the local stray dogs. The dogs would follow us around for a time and greet us daily. They were two pretty big mutts that we had befriended. One day these guys roll up in a shady, falling apart red sports car. They said they wanted us to come party with them and followed us when we refused. We started to get scared and went to the other side of the street to avoid them. Only they turned around and continued to follow us, pleading to come with them. At the seemingly perfect moment, the dogs we had been feeding ran up to the car and started barking / trying to bite the passenger. He rolled up his window and drove away. I have no idea how those dogs must have sensed we were in danger and came to our rescue, but we gave them extra sausages that day. I don't know what would have happened if they didn't chase the guys off. This happened back in 2008, just after my family had moved to a rural town in Oregon. I was 12 at the time and my family and I were driving home after visiting my step-grandparents that evening. It was late, around 11 p.m., and my mom had decided to take the unlit country back road home. I was in the back seat with my younger brother, trying to tune out my parents' incessant arguing up front while my brother was zoning out and looking out the back window. Very suddenly he nudges me and points out the back window, insisting I turn around and look. I'm very tired and irritated with my parents who at this point won't stop yelling at one another, so I shrug him off. He becomes more insistent, and I can hear fear creeping into his voice. I pull up my hoodie and ignore him. Now he's frantically trying to get my parents' attention and they're screaming at him to shut up. This goes on for a while but eventually, he calms down, although I can hear him turn around in his seat every once in a while to look out the back window. The next day I ask him what he had all worked up in the car. He describes to me in a shaky voice that something had been following behind the car the night before. He detailed seeing 3 dim points of blue-white light arranged in a black triangle shape following closely behind the car, and when my mom would brake the tail lights lit it dimly so he could see a dome shape in the middle of the black mass. He said it didn't jostle around like a car would when my mom drove over the potholes in the road, and it was following us closely, so he thought maybe it was hovering off the ground. It sounds ridiculous, but he told me this with such conviction and fear in his voice I know he must have seen something that night. We drove that road many times after and never experienced anything like that again. My friend had invited me to go on a trip to Universal Florida with her family. On the way back home we picked up their new puppy, so we made frequent stops to let it use the restroom. It was around 8 p.m. when we stopped at a gas station in a smaller town. My friend and I decided to go in and use the restroom. When we got to the door there were 2 bigger men at the counter talking to the cashier. I reached to open the door but the man closest to it reached over and held it shut for about 30 seconds while they continued to talk to the cashier. This should have been my first clue to hold my piss and get back to the car. But eventually, he moved and let us in. The bathroom was one of those single stalls, so I went and used it first, then waited on my friend by the door once I was finished. I noticed the guys kept glancing in my direction, and I was starting to feel very uneasy. My friend and I exited the building and were talking about how odd the men were when not 30 seconds after we left, the 2 men started following us. Luckily, my friend's car wasn't too far down the sidewalk, and we booked it the rest of the way, jumping into the car as fast as we could. The 2 men slowed down and kept walking as soon as they saw my friend's mother in the car, and luckily that was the end of it, but goddamn I have never been so creeped out in my life. I'm positive if we had been alone we would have been abducted that night. When I was in 5th grade I was at my friend's house. We were hanging out behind her house by the lake. Two high schooler guys came up and saw us. One guy said, "Oh, okay, we will leave." We both had a strange feeling in our stomachs and left to go to her house. We stayed there for 15 minutes before heading back up to our spot. Once we got there, the two guys were there. They asked if we wanted to sit there, however, we declined their offer and started walking on the dam. After about 50 feet I hear something behind me, so I look over my shoulder. They were following us. I told my friend that, obviously she didn't believe me till she looked too. At that point, they were running after us. We hauled ass as the adrenaline started pumping through us. We got to the end of the dam where the dry waterfall was. I looked over my shoulder and saw one was following our exact route and the other was attempting to cut us off. Somehow we managed to outrun them after running for what seemed like an eternity. When we made it to her dad's house, we didn't leave for a long time. We decided not to tell our parents. In hindsight, we should have. But scared they would never let us go back up there. It's been about 10 years and I have only gone up there one time since that happened, and I was anxious the entire time. Background: my old room in my old house is basically a pseudo-attic. It's on the same level as the attic and has doors that lead to it. One weekday, I'm playing video games like I always do when I'm truant. I start to hear banging against one of the doors. Not like knocking banging, like, "Let me into your room so I can kill you," kind of banging. Something was really mad at me. I thought it was some angry animal that got into my attic through the roof. Called my mom, I was 15 I think, to call my brother, who never answers my phone calls, to come home while describing the situation. He was busy, so she decided to come home to look in the attic. Nothing in there. I thought for a while that something made me hallucinate. I never did drugs and didn't have any illnesses that made me hallucinate, PTSD. But not in that manner. We moved out, and later my mom talked with the current house owner while she was out walking. They asked her if there was anything unusual about upstairs, my room, and he basically told her that dogs go to that same door and scratch and stare up at it. It's creepy.
In 2015, I was on vacation in London, UK, staying with some family. I ventured out to the neighborhood's commercial area to do some shopping on my own one day. On my way back, a man came up next to me and handed me a cigarette. I was like, oh sweet. I'm on vacation, gonna treat myself to smoke and light it up. The man then started walking awfully close to me. He wasn't exceptionally large, but I'm a very small woman, 4 feet 10 inches 100 pounds. He started asking me questions about myself. Where my accent was from, how old I was, etc. He asked me to go for drinks that night and I politely declined. Said I was only there for another day. He got upset with me and kept pestering me, please love, tonight just you and me, let's do it, etc. It was getting really annoying and scary, so I told him to please leave me alone. Then he put his arm around me and held me close as we were walking, shoved his phone in my hand, and kept telling me to add my number. I tried to explain to him that I wasn't from the UK and didn't have a phone. But he didn't really understand and was getting more aggressive. I was panicking at this point. I broke free from him and bolted down the street. After a couple of blocks, I stopped to catch my breath, didn't see him anywhere, and kept walking. Then a couple of minutes later, somebody comes up and grabs me from behind. This man ran up to me and was practically wrestling me on the street. It was nuts. It was also in broad daylight, tons of people walking around, and nobody batted an eye, LOL Londoners. I finally threw him off me, and I think the adrenaline really kicked in. I ran all the way home, taking a couple of detours on the way, terrifying.
Almost a decade ago I was on a business trip for the company I worked for with a few fellow co-workers that I knew pretty well. A Friday before heading home, we were close to Dorney Park in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and figured we had enough time to hit a few rides before heading home the next day. It was hotter than hell that week, easily over 100 degrees each day, so naturally only the water park made sense. we went down a few water slides and found a 4-person tube ride to close out the water park. We grab the tube and start our trek to the top of the water slide. Surprisingly enough, there are a ton of signs about the weight limit, caution riding, etc. A friend of mine starts getting really concerned about the signs and asks all of our weights. I was the lightest at about 165, Jeff, the one asking, was about 280, Sean around 300, and Scott was about 330. We were a large group. All these signs are saying weight shouldn't exceed 800 pounds while riding. Needless to say, we tell him to stop being a pussy and go on with it. We finally get to the top and start getting settled in, waiting our turn to go. Jeff immediately stops the lifeguard girl and asks, "Hey, I think we're quite a bit overweight, should we even be going down this thing?" The girl looks at all of us and asks, "Well, how much do you all weigh?" Collectively? "About 1,000 pounds, she says. Hang on to go and ask the other lifeguard to literally comes over and give a sturdy, "You're fine," and starts us down the slide. We slowly start down the top of the slide and ease into the first bank. I manage to spin around to the side that's going to the side of the slope and my ass goes off the edge of the slide. I laughed in terror that this already wasn't good. We gained so much speed going into the next bank we shot up the side of the slide and it shot me out of the tube at the highest point. I was literally overlooking the park. I was so high, I could see straight down to the ground, and was flapping my arms like a cartoon character trying to fly. Jeff somehow managed to grab my foot and pull me back into the slide where I fell on Sean's head, and we all bailed out of the tube. We rode the rest of the way down with no tube at all, tossing and turning and trying to keep my heart from beating out of my chest. We hit the bottom pool where you exit and the lifeguard had tears running down his face from laughing so hard because of what he just saw.
My sister, myself, and 3 friends were camping in my friend's fenced-in backyard one night. 3 of us were 15 and the other 2 were 13. We sat in the tent and talked late into the night when we heard scratching on the tent. There was just enough light outside that we could see a silhouette of a person walking around the tent. We thought it was our friend's older brother, so we started yelling at him, "Casey, stop trying to scare us, Casey, leave us alone." He didn't say anything. This tent had mesh at the top of the tent so you can see outside, so one friend stood up to tell him off. Immediately after standing up and opening her mouth to yell at him, I saw her pale and she sat back down, terrified. "It's not Casey." That sent a chill down my spine. We all shut up and sat there, silently panicking, watching this guy continue to walk around the tent. He must have heard us, but still, he stayed. Finally, my bravest friend started yelling at the guy, threatening him and putting on a big show. We heard him kind of shuffle away and that's when she burst out of the tent to try and scare him off. She later told me that as she ran out of the tent she saw this guy standing by the gate into the yard, messing with his pants, like he was putting himself back together. She chased him out of the yard and watched him run down the street and around the corner. We all went inside after that and I'm still uncomfortable with camping 13 years later.
Was overseas vacationing in Japan with my fiancé. We met another American guy there one day when we were walking around town shopping. Had a polite conversation with him, exchanged contact information, and then expected to part ways and meet up another day. Instead, he decided to tag along with us as we were shopping. Odd. I think it would be pretty boring to be a third wheel to 2 people you just met while they shop for sneakers. This is when I started getting an odd vibe from him. He said he had come to the city to meet up with his friends but suddenly he was tagging along with us instead. I asked what happened to his friends and he said he would meet up with them later. He began asking very probing and inappropriate questions. "You guys have a lot of money, huh? Where do you get your money from? An ATM? Do your parents wire it to you?" Now I'm nearly certain this guy wants to rob us. Who asks things like that? I texted my fiancé that we need to lose this guy. He doesn't seem to think there is anything wrong with the guy, that he's just about awkward and lonely. I decided he wasn't going to be much help, so I took matters into my own hands. After we left the shoe store, we had plans to spend that day shopping. The guy insists we go together to ride some theme park rides at Dome City. We can walk through this park as a shortcut and it's very beautiful. We try to change the subject as that isn't part of our plan for the day, and he somehow manages to mention the park 3 more times. At this point, I'm practically screaming inside my head that my fiancé doesn't see anything suspicious about the way he's acting. I fake a headache and say very sternly I want to go home now. The guy brings up the park again, saying I can rest there until I feel better. WTF. I say no, fiancé, and I am going home now. I don't feel well, you should go catch up with your friends. He reluctantly agrees, but then reminds us to check our email so that we can meet up tomorrow. I made it clear to my so that we would not contact him again and not respond to any emails. To this day I am 99% certain he planning to lead us to a trap and rob us, or potentially worse. It was the last couple of days of summer vacation, and I was going into either 8th or 9th grade. I decided to take an evening walk, just drinking a soda, and walking around, enjoying the weather. I was walking behind some store buildings and tossing some rocks when a car drove through. I stepped out of the way, let them pass, and left. I went across the street to a different parking lot, under some lights because it was getting dark. I look back and see the same car had actually turned around in a 15 to 20 foot wide back alley. Basically, it's hard to turn in that area. I'm still walking, and it's matching my speed. After a couple of minutes, I get fed up that I was being followed. I stop, turn to face the car. It had broken when I stopped, and stared straight at the driver's side window. As soon as I did that, this stepped on it and disappeared. A while later, I saw the same car in the same apartment complex where I lived. I haven't seen the car since.
This story takes a disappointing, or is it, turn, but when I was 16 I had just gotten home from school. I was home alone. I go up to my bedroom to lie down, and I'm pretty sure I heard the doorbell. I think that's how I noticed him. Anyway, the little windows next to the front door didn't have the little curtains that go on them, so I peek my head from behind the wall upstairs and it was a man. I run across the hallway, which was visible from the front door windows, and I peek outside their windows. The man is in my driveway with a camera. He notices me looking at him. He is smiling right at me. Eventually, he leaves. I explain this to my parents when they get home. It was an insurance employee. Side note, these stories gave me chills and now I'm too afraid to go outside my room and use the bathroom.
I was a 15-year-old in a new town. I had been partying a bit, drinking, and smoking, etc. I realize I have to head downtown to catch the bus home as the last one was running in about 20 minutes. A couple of friends decide to walk me and we head out to the station. As we near the police station I get all paranoid and we decide to walk the alley behind. No idea why I thought this was safer, I was a dumb teen. Near the end of the block, we see what appears to be a dude asleep, leaning against the building. A friend nudges his foot to see if he's okay and no response. I take his hat off and there are just glassy empty eyes staring right at me through my soul. I panic and pull back, with this dude's hat still in my hand. I knocked over a dead guy. We all freak out and run to the police station to report. Insta sober, police officers never found how messed up I was, and I got a ride home instead of busing it. This was an experience I had around 2010. I lived in a 2-bedroom condo, but my roommate wasn't home. I woke up to someone or something in a black hooded cape sitting on the edge of my bed. It turned around and its cape was full of millions of stars. It had an extremely low voice and told me that something bad will happen to me in the next 2 weeks. It then evaporated into the painting in front of my bed. My sister died shortly after this. She had many health issues leading up to her passing, so I reckon this experience was probably my subconscious fears mixing with sleep paralysis. However, she was getting better around this time, regardless. It was terrifying, and I still get shivers thinking about it to this day.
Thanks for watching. Please comment, like, share and subscribe. The Internet Surfer on YouTube for more horror and scary stories.